Oh, they asked him how he cooked the turkey so well, and he said, well, I have a secret recipe. He said, I fill the cavity not only with stuffing, but raw popcorn. And when the ass blows off, I know it's ready. This is his very early life in Ottawa, where he was elected first at the age of 27 as alderman. So he started very early in life a real interest and participation in politics. I started much, much later. I was in my mid-50s when I was elected in North Saanich for the first time. So Dad certainly got started as a young man. He died on January the 15th, 1988, and at the time an obituary written by John Micah, the reporter for the Times Colonist, described him as one of the good guys. Apparently, my understanding is Dad had earned the respect of politicians across the spectrum as both a Liberal MLA from 1948 to 1952, and then as Reeve of Saanich from 1953 to 1958, as I mentioned. He resigned the mayoralty in Saanich in June of 1958 to move with our family to the United States, where Mom and Dad lived until 1973, and then in 1973 they returned to Victoria to retire. And Dad became involved again in the community as a trustee on the cemetery board that oversaw the Royal Oak Burial Park. He was always active in community and public affairs, as much as I can remember, and was appointed to the BC Parole Board upon their return to Victoria. He served on the BC Parole Board for 3 years, which was a bit unusual for Dad. I didn't know he had an interest in corrections and criminal justice, but maybe it was because I was working as a probation officer at the time and he took an interest as a result of that. And then, as I say, he served on the cemetery board of Greater Victoria and advocated for many, many years for the installation of a columbaria at Royal Oak Park. And these are the marble or granite. They're large. They look almost like this, actually. And they have little boxes inside where ashes are inurned. And Dad talked about these and brought the concept to the cemetery board because he had seen them in the United States. And he felt that land would become scarce in the Royal Oak area, and he thought this was a great way to save space and a respectful way to save space. So that's why eventually the columbaria was installed, and there was a ceremony 6 months after he died that Mum attended. And he always loved a joke, and I think he would have liked this article that was written 6 months after his death. While he did not live to see the fruition of his vision for a columbaria, the TC article said, excuse me, tongue-in-cheek, "Ashes, ashes were the first to be inurned at the columbarium during a dedication ceremony in June 1988. So he would have loved that. Dad's early life, he was born September 30th, 1906 in Brandon, Manitoba, the second eldest of 4 boys. Their eldest brother, and Dad always talked a lot about Donald. Donald was the eldest child. He died of a heart condition at age 9. And Dad said, sadly today, that wouldn't have happened. He would have survived. I think they called it a leaking valve of the heart. And I remember my grandmother talking about Donald as well, my dad's mom. And she lived with us, Kate. There's a picture of Kate there. She lived with us until she died in 1958. Dad was raised and educated in Ottawa. The family moved to Ottawa. And he spent a lot of time at the family summer cottage in Britannia. And as well, he lived in Ottawa and spent time at Britannia through the 1920s and 30s. Then he suffered the loss of his closest friend, Bert Marshall, who was shot and killed on an Ottawa street in front of my father. My father was with Bert. They had just gotten out of Bert's car, and someone came up and shot him. And so Dad, from that point forward, was very much a pacifist and very anti-gun. Obviously, that would have had a huge impact on him, and he never actually got over it. He was in his 20s at the time, and the story was that there had been a trial of a murder, and Bert was going to be testifying as a witness, and he was killed. So In 1934, though, at the age of 28, his political career began when he was elected alderman of Ottawa Council, and his mentor, great mentor, was Charlotte Whitten. So for those of you who might remember that name, I think she's as famous as Hazel McCallion, who just retired at 93 as the oldest mayor in Canada. So then, during that time, he became a member of the Princess Louise Dragoon Guards, their mounted regiment. So he was riding horses through the streets of Ottawa. It was hard to imagine my father riding horses through the streets of Ottawa, but he did. And during a ceremony in the front of the Governor General in the 1930s, I would think this would be the late 30s, Dad's horse threw him into a snowbank. It was in the middle of winter. And so I gather as he was getting up and cleaning himself off, the Governor General yelled, "Are you all right, Ash?" And he said, "Yes, I'm fine." So he always said, "I fell on my ash off the horse." And then he remounted the horse and continued with the procession. He served then as a captain during World War II in the Canadian Army and was stationed in London during the Blitz. He remembers the Blitz very well, and he did talk about it, but Dad actually never saw combat apart from the bombing in London, which would have been frightening enough. He contracted double pneumonia, and so he was hospitalized in London. And that's when he learned how to needlepoint, because they had to give these ailing soldiers something to do in their spare time while they were bedridden. So Dad learned to needlepoint, which is an unusual hobby for a man, at least then it was. But he did some beautiful needlework, which I still have. He also learned to hook rugs. He was very craftsy, Dad, actually. Not just crafty, but craftsy as well. He then married my mother, Vera Marie Carney, in 1943 in Victoria. Her father and her mother and stepfather lived in Victoria. So they were married here, and the reception was here. And then Mother and Dad, after the war, came back from Ottawa in 1946 and moved to Victoria. We actually, when I was very small, about 2 years of age, Mom and Dad rented a house at Elk Lake on Brookley Road called Raynham, and I think it's still there. The house is still there. It was a lovely spot, and I remember we lived next door to the Porters, and I was just speaking with Enid about the Porters. I called them Uncle and Auntie Porter, and in fact, at the age of 3 or 4, that was where I first met my future husband, Fred Green. This is very odd, but he was fishing with his Uncle Stan, I believe Uncle Stan. Uncle Stan worked with the municipality of Saanich around the time I think my father was mayor. And Stan and Fred came to the Porters to launch their boat, and I was always over at the Porters, always running around in a diaper, and that's when Fred first met me, apparently. Which I did not know until many years later. So Dad's early life was a very happy one in Ottawa. He was active in local politics there, and he continued that political career upon moving to Saanich in 1946. He was convinced to run in 1948 in a provincial, I believe it was a provincial by-election at that year, and he was running as part of the Liberal government, and it was a Liberal-Conservative coalition. They actually won the election in 1948. Dad then became an MLA, and in fact, during that time, he wrote the first labor code for British Columbia. And a woman named Dorothy Sage, I don't know how many of you know that name, but Dorothy, who has since passed away, Dorothy was the secretary that traveled with my father all over British Columbia during the preparation of the labor code. Dorothy went on then to become the senior administrative secretary to Bill Vander Zalm. So Dorothy had a very, very long and enduring career in the public service. But she started with my father, so that was interesting. Vicky Cool is another name that we know in Saanich. My dad mentored Vicky, I understand, in her political career. So there were a number of people that Dad touched during that time. Then after the defeat of the coalition government in British Columbia by W.A.C. Bennett and the Socreds, Dad was convinced to run for mayor of Saanich. as he had represented Saanich in the legislature. There were a couple of interesting stories that my sister reminded me about as I was doing the research for this project. One was that when there was a leadership race for the coalition government, it was a race between Gordon Wismer, who was a well-known lawyer at the time, and Boss Johnson. And Dad came outside. There was a break in the proceedings, and Dad came outside, and he found a man named Duff Botelho. Do any of you recognize that name? Duff Botelho was sitting in a chair looking rather forlorn, so my father went up to him and said, "Why are you sitting out here, Duff? Aren't you inside listening to what's going on?" And he said, "Well, Arthur, quite frankly, I got tired of watching the backstabbers backstab the backstabbers." So that was a story that Dad always told. It doesn't sound like politics has changed all that much since then. He ran successfully in 1953 as Reeve of Saanich and had a wonderful 5 years, I think 2 terms, as the Reeve. And he really, really loved Saanich, my father. I remember that well. We grew up in Lake Hill, actually, on Cumberland Road. And that was a wonderful, very happy time for our family. We spent very happy times on Cumberland Road. It was a wonderful, wonderful place to raise a young family. Dad had a wonderful garden. He was a great gardener. He grew vegetables, he grew flowers. He was amazing. And there were always tour buses that would come by up Cumberland to see his garden, which was interesting. So he had a very strong artistic side, Dad had. He had quite a controversial period of time as Reeve of Saanich, and I wasn't aware of this until recently. As you know, the amalgamation question is back on the public agenda. There's been a lot of talk recently about it, largely because of the failed sewage solution in the CRD. But Dad actually was a proponent of amalgamation, and in 1957 caused quite a stir at Saanich Council when he talked about it. And what his vision was to take the urban part of Saanich and have it amalgamated with the urban core, Greater Victoria, and then the rural part of Saanich would be amalgamated with Central Saanich, Sydney, and North Saanich. So that was an interesting concept at the time. He knew that he would be defeated on that issue if he ran and, was a proponent. So I guess it was safe for him to talk about it because he knew he was leaving to go to the United States. Amalgamation is still being talked about today, and I think he would be most interested to hear the discussion. From 1976 until his death, as I mentioned earlier, he served on the provincial BC Board of Parole and then on the cemetery board. What he loved about the cemetery board, he used to tell me, was he didn't have a lot of feedback from his constituents. And he said that was refreshing. He could make decisions and not worry about anyone's reaction. Again, he was a bit of a visionary. He envisioned the columbaria, and they are there today. He would be very pleased to know that that came about. And he was a visionary when it came to talking about amalgamation and shared services. I also remember he talked about the fact that he thought the Pat Bay Highway was too small, that 2 lanes either side were not enough, and that the proposal should involve 3 lanes either side because he could see a time when traffic would be heavy. Well, he was correct. I mean, Fred and I, when we lived in North Saanich for 18 years, that drive, it was a busy drive back and forth. I worked in town. And I then commuted by bus as a result of the traffic. I didn't like driving in it in the morning and then driving home at night, particularly in the winter. But he was right. The traffic volume on Pat Bay Highway is pretty heavy. You will notice that in all of the pictures of my father, he is bald. And he has a great-granddaughter, Hadley, who is our son's daughter. She's 10 months old, and he'll be happy to know that Hadley is just as bald as he was. But he decided in later life, this was a rather bizarre decision that my father made, he wanted a hairpiece. And so suddenly, at the age of 67, he had hair. And it was very unusual. My mother, we all used to cringe, my mother and my sister and I. And the hairpieces got bigger and bigger. The first one was flat and brown and looked quite respectable, but by the time he died, they were quite flamboyant. And My mother called me shortly after he died, and she said, I have a real dilemma. Do we send him away bald, or do we send him away in the hairpiece? And I said, well, not to be irreverent, but I think he should, Mom, that's a decision you'll have to make. I don't want to have to make it. So what she did was she did send him away bald and he donated the hairpieces to the Langham Court Theatre. So that was a good compromise. He was a character. There was another story about Dad. We lived in Reno, Nevada. That's where he worked in labor relations. He had a very successful career after leaving Victoria in labor relations. And my sister at the time, as a teenager after school, was working in a child care nursery. And there were 3 of them, actually. This woman owned 3 nurseries in Reno. And one year, she needed a Santa Claus. And my father was quite a stout man, and he certainly had the body for the part. So he rented a Santa suit, and he had a friend drive him around to each of the nurseries where he was Santa. And apparently he was a marvelous Santa. But by the time he got home, which was fairly late in the evening, because after the duties were done, his friend took him for drinks. And Dad always loved a drink. Anyway, they had quite a bit, or at least my father had quite a bit. And he arrived home. Mother opened the door. I remember this so well. It was really quite amazing. I was about 16. My sister would have been 12. And Mother opened the door, and Chrissy and I are standing behind her, and there's Dad's friend holding Dad up in this giant Santa suit. And he just left him at the door. He said, Marie, here's Arthur, and off he went. Arthur couldn't walk, and so what happened was that Mother got the door open, and then Dad pitched forward onto his stomach in the hallway in the Santa suit. And my father was a very, very private person, and neither my sister nor I had ever seen him undressed in any way, shape, or form. But Mother, it took the 3 of us to get him down the hallway. We had to drag him because he was too big to lift. And we dragged him all the way down to the bedroom, and we got him into bed. And I think the next morning, he woke up and said to my mother, how did you do this by yourself? And she said, well, Arthur, it was quite a trial. And she was afraid to tell him that the girls had helped her. So we finally saw Dad in his underwear and undershirt. That was it. But I'll never forget it. It was a very funny story. But Dad, was very active. He was very engaged all of his life, right up until the time he died. He was a wonderful grandfather to our son, Matthew, who is now 33. And Matthew still has very, very vivid memories of Poppy. That's what he called him. And I'm just sorry that Dad couldn't have lived first to see another federal Liberal government, because Mom and Dad were great Liberals, and Mother was active in Lady Laurier until her death. And of course, Dad was an active federal Liberal. And also, I'm sorry that they couldn't live to see their great-grandchild, who is Hadley, Matthew's little girl. That makes 5 grandchildren for Fred, and Hadley is my first. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful gift this last year. So I think I've tried to capture his life. I know a lot of you, some of you were affiliated with Dad when he was working as mayor of Saanich, Reeve of Saanich. I think he would be quite interested in what's going on in Saanich today. Saanich has changed drastically since the 1950s, the late 1950s, and I've certainly lived to see a number of changes, as all of you have, and many of you in this room have seen many more changes than I have as well. But I'm quite happy to take now questions, or if you have any short anecdotes about Dad, that would be wonderful too. And those are basically my comments today. This was a very interesting journey, as I said, researching his life in politics. But my sister and I spent a lot of time together, remembering things together. Mother had thrown out a lot of things when she moved and downsized. So although Chrissy, we had a lot of photographs, we did not have a lot of content. And so that required researching newspaper articles and required some research in terms of photographs, and then, of course, with each other, our collective memory, my sister and me trying to remember a lot of the stories. And I think I've captured them all. I hope I have anyway. And I want to thank you for listening, and thank you very much. And please feel free to come and view the pictures. So, are there any questions? Thank you.
Thanks. Didn't your mom and dad operate a little store?
They did, actually. Thanks, Helen, for the reminder. Mom and Dad operated, it was called the Rock Street Grocery at the time. It's still there. I was born behind that grocery. It was called Mary Arts. Yeah. So it was a combination of Marie and Arthur. This is good, Helen. It's wonderful to have family in the audience because they remind you. Yes, that's right. They had the Mary Arts Rock Street Grocery, and for a number of years. And then Dad, there is a picture of Dad in his shoe store on Government Street. He sold Florsheim shoes, and that was what he did while he was involved in politics. In fact, Gordon Wismer, apparently, who was the Attorney General eventually in British Columbia, used to come and visit Dad, and they would go into the back of the store and have chit-chats and spin yarns, I'm sure. Gordon Wismer, I believe, was an interesting man. I understand he had a bit of a dodgy reputation, but we won't go into that here today. But there are a number of stories about politicians, obviously. I mean, that's the nature of the beast. Thank you, though, for that reminder. Yes, Mom used to put me as a baby in a little wicker basket in the back with all the groceries because they had a little mini, and she would deliver groceries door to door in the area. Any other questions or memories?
Of the farm where you lived at Maple Bay, you and Fred.
Oh, we lived. Fred and I moved to Maple Bay, and it was the Considine house. So, of course, Chris Considine is a lawyer locally, and it was his grandfather's home. You're right, John. Thank you for that reminder. See how helpful Fred's brother John. You see, these are all very helpful. We lived on Considine Avenue in Maple Bay, and this was the house that belonged to Chris Considine's grandfather. He built it in 1912. Sadly, the house was demolished just a few years ago to make way for a new home, which is something that is happening a lot now, not only in Vancouver. Vancouver is not the only victim of demolition, but we are facing the same thing, particularly in Oak Bay. I'm currently chairing the Oak Bay Heritage Commission, and it's a big concern. We are losing a lot of small bungalows, older bungalows, and the odd heritage home has come down, I'm sure, over the last few years, but this is a big problem. And, unfortunately, change and progress, they are not often kind to history and heritage. So we all have to be very vigilant about preserving our historical landscapes and landmarks. It's important. Yes?
My dad worked at the Saanich Waterworks.
Oh, gosh.
And I can remember Dad saying all we needed with Rebash was a handshake for an agreement.
Thank you.
You didn't need
to write something. Yeah, a man of his word.
Handshake, that was it.
Thanks very much. That was my understanding, too, that Dad was a man of his word, that he kept his word, and that if he said he was going to do something, he would do it. And when I was first elected in 2005 in North Saanich, that was something I carried. That was the legacy I carried with me, that I promised myself that I would never make a promise to a constituent that I didn't keep. So that was a gift that he gave me. Thank you very much for that memory.
Bert Pearson was the chief of police at that time, wasn't he?
Yes, I believe he was. Yep.
And what Ellen just said about the handshake carried through in the sense of ethics.
Oh, right, I forgot. Thank you, Fred. When Dad was defeated as an MLA, when Wacky Bennett won, I shouldn't say Wacky, I'm sorry, W.A.C. Bennett, that's what he called him, that's why. When Wack Bennett won the election, he approached my dad and he said, listen, Arthur, if you cross the floor, you can have the Ministry of Labor, you can be the Minister of Labor. Because, of course, Dad had done the Labor Code. And Dad said, no, I'm sorry, I have principles and I can't do that. And he walked away from provincial politics, which is quite amazing for someone who, Mother and Dad eked out a living with a shoe store. It wasn't a big money maker. And then, of course, they had the little grocery store. And it would have been an opportunity for Dad to perhaps have a stable income in some ways and some notoriety, but he walked away from all of it and just said, no, I can't do that, because it would have meant abandoning his liberal principles and his political ethics. And that was another example of what that meant to him. But, you know, I don't know how often that would happen these days. It's not a common practice that a politician walks away from an active or lucrative political career. I'm sure it does happen, but that was quite something at the time. And it was very hard on the family, I think, as well, on my mum especially. And speaking of mum, I wanted to emphasize that they were a team. While this is about Dad, this presentation, it was very much also about my mother. My mother and Dad worked very well together and very hard together. And that continued throughout their married life. I actually think that Mother had times been different, could have had her own very successful political career. She was dynamite. She was an organizer. She was amazing and full of energy right up until, well, the last 4 years of her life were a struggle, because she developed a heart condition that was very difficult for her. But she was in her 89th year when she died. Dad was in his 82nd. But I really think she could have had a strong political career herself. And these are pictures of Dad on election eve. This is the night he won the election provincially. And then I'm not sure where these were taken, but this was during his MLA career, Mother and Dad. And Mother did a lot of campaigning for him. She was an amazing supporter, his best one, obviously. Any other questions or? Yes?
So your dad was worried about the social credit, but what were the main differences in the principles between the liberals and the social credit?
Gosh, Grant, I don't know. I wish I knew. I don't know what the primary differences were. The current government, the BC Liberals, are not Liberals. They are a coalition themselves of Conservatives and social credit. I would suspect the social credit government at that time was perhaps more right of centre than the BC Liberal government of the day, but I can't say for sure. But knowing my father, Dad was certainly a moderate in his thinking generally. He used to make a joke about CCF, which then became NDP. He always said that the NDP, or that the Liberals were a lot like the NDP, but the NDP were just in a greater hurry. So in other words, the NDP were Liberals in a hurry, and that's what he always said. But Dad was a moderate. Of course I was a child, so I don't remember. Most of you would remember, perhaps better than I do, what the social credit government was like and why it was elected. It certainly built highways, didn't it? That was a big, I think it was more capitalistic, perhaps. They were popular, though. And also in Alberta, weren't they, at one time?
I think that's where they started.
That's where they started, right.
They did dams.
Oh, and dams, right. Dams and highways.
Yeah.
But Wacky Bennett lasted a long time. He was a very successful politician, as was his son, Bill.
It was colorful.
And colorful, yeah. Not as colorful as Bill Vander Zalm, though. He was pretty colorful.
Well, Gallardi was colorful.
And Gallardi was, yeah.
He was probably the boss.
Well, Dad used to, of course, make quite a few remarks about the social credit government, and we won't go into those today. But when he came back, he was re-engaged. It was as though he had never left politics. He was right back at it and remained active, as I say, until he died. He died suddenly. He did not, he had a couple of heart attacks the year that our son was born, Matthew, so 1982. He suffered his first heart attack in 1982 in March, the month that Matthew was born, and then he had a second heart attack in August of that year. He was, his lifestyle was not great. Dad sat a lot, needle pointing and hooking rugs. He liked a tipple. Brandy was his favorite. He loved his food. His diet was not great, though. I mean, he would eat great bowls of ice cream at night and then go to bed, you know, and so he was heavy, and he didn't walk. He didn't exercise at all. So when he suffered the first heart attack, it was a terrible scare, and the doctor basically said, you have to start walking. And he started walking, and he walked with a vengeance. He also smoked. He stopped smoking, and at the age of 75, he started walking, and he walked and he walked. And besides the hairpiece, which he bought in the United States, he also adopted other American things in his dress, and one of them were white knee socks, white patent leather shoes. I mean, I have to close my eyes because he was quite a sight. He would wear these big turquoise belt buckles that he bought in Arizona, and this ridiculous hairpiece, and he would walk the block. Mom and Dad lived in a condominium just below Camosun College. Well, all my girlfriends would phone up, oh my God, we just saw your father out walking. He's got on the white tights, he's got the white shorts, you know, and they would, it was quite funny. Anyway, he walked a lot, and I think that really helped to save or allow him to live longer. And then he died at 81.
In his sleep?
He died in his sleep, yeah.
Could you describe his dress when he left British Columbia and his dress when he came back from the States?
Do I have to? Okay. When he left Victoria, he wore a Homburg hat. He wore dark suits, very conservative. He dressed very conservatively, as you see in these pictures. When he came back from the United States, again, you know, white shorts, white patent leather shoes, white knee-high knee socks, you know, very bright colors, this big hairpiece. As I say, it got bigger and bigger, and it was amazing, you know, the transformation. They went to England one year, and I begged him not to dress, you know, don't take the hairpiece, Dad, to England, and don't take the turquoise jewelry, and don't take, you know, we gave him a hard time, actually. It wasn't very nice. But he loved the United States. He really enjoyed their time there, and he adapted. He adapted very well to the American sort of way of life. We had a group of women and I used to say, never trust a man that wears a gold chain and tasseled loafers. Yeah, never trust. So, of course, Dad came back with gold chains, with, tasseled loafers. It was a riot. But he was, as I say, a great character. And he loved a good story. He loved a joke. He was a jolly fellow, really, and a wonderful grandfather to Matthew. I remember arriving home one day. He'd been taking care of Matthew. Mother always said, bring him over, and then she'd go out and leave him with Dad. And I came in, and Dad was in a bit of a tizzy, and he said, he had a very messy diaper, Cairine, and but I've done my best. And the poor guy, he had gone he was desperate to find a cloth. I mean, he didn't, Mother did the housework. No. But he got the cloth from under the sink, and my mother used Ajax to clean the bathroom. So you can imagine, and he used that on poor old Matt. So there was a bit of a panic when I arrived, when he told me that. And he did do his best, poor guy. But he was a great granddad, he really was. He taught Matt a lot. He spent a lot of time. Without him, actually, I went back to work part-time on contract because he was prepared to provide childcare for Matthew. And for a 75-plus-year-old man, that was a big commitment. But he was in love with that child, honestly. And in fact, the best memory I have, I mean, it was a great shock when he died in his sleep. We didn't see it coming at all. The night before he died, I phoned him from Maple Bay. We were living in Maple Bay. And he was heartbroken when Fred and I moved to Maple Bay from Victoria because it meant he wouldn't see as much of Matthew. But I phoned him and I said, look, would you like to have Matt for the weekend? That was on a Thursday night. He died on a Friday. And I remember he was so excited. He was so excited because I said, I'll drive down, because I was commuting then to Victoria to work. And I said, I'll drive down tomorrow morning and I'll drop him off, Dad, and you can have him for the weekend. How's that? And he and Mom was thrilled too, but Dad really spent a lot of time with him. And so I'm really glad that that was the last thing that he knew, before he died in his sleep that night.
He roasted the turkey, didn't he, at Christmas time?
Yes, he always cooked the turkey. At Christmas time, he loved Christmas. He loved decorating the tree, and Christmas was wonderful at our house. And when we lived in the United States, the Americans don't celebrate Christmas the way we do, and their big holiday is Thanksgiving for them. But their American friends, everybody wanted an invitation to Arthur and Marie's for Christmas dinner because they just loved the sort of Anglo tradition of Christmas. And he used to say, John, that reminds me, and he always cooked the turkey. He always made the stuffing, and it was delicious. He was very good at it. But he used to say, he always told this story at the dinner table, of course. He said, well, you should be very happy. They asked him how he cooked the turkey so well. And he said, well, I have a secret recipe. He said, I fill the cavity, not only with stuffing, but raw popcorn. And when the asp blows off, I know it's ready. I hope I didn't offend anyone, but that was his story he used to tell. I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed the experience of putting this together. It was an honor to be asked. Thank you very much. And I know Dad would be thrilled if he knew we were doing this, today. And he would be thrilled that Saanich, basically Saanich, the rural part of Saanich, is still intact, I think. So he would be very happy that we were doing this in Saanich as well, in Royal Oak, too, where of course, where the Med Grill is, where he spent a lot of time, the old hall. Thank you, everybody, for your attention.